It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, to the Global Solutions Summit, taking place in spectacularly tumultuous times. And I believe that it is absolutely of historic significance that you had hardly come into office, that you witness a war in Europe in addition to the problems of climate change, pandemic. You have the presidency of the German G7, and despite your incredibly packed schedule, I thank you from all my heart for attending the Global Solutions Summit. You've been a long-time participant at the Global Solutions Summit, and last year you addressed us as Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to address you as Chancellor and welcome you to the Global Solutions Summit, which understands itself as a stepping stone now to both the T20 G20 and the T7 G7. And I believe that we will do everything that we can to support you in this process. The summit provides an enormous opportunity to engage the whole rest of the world, and you have captured the spirit of the times by calling this Zeitenwende, and have impressed the entire world with the courageousness and the speed with which you have responded to that challenge. And now everyone in this room, as well as countless people on the screens, are eager to hear your words. Thank you very much and welcome.
Lieber Dennis Nauer, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren.
Dennis Nauer, ladies and gentlemen. On February 24th, President Putin launched a vicious war of aggression against Ukraine. A war of aggression that puts the European and global peace order at risk. In the Bundestag, I spoke of a historical turning point. First of all, that was a call to action to ourselves, to Germany, a call to invest more in our security, in the security of Europe and the transatlantic alliance, but also a call to reduce strategic dependencies, especially in the energy sector. But globally, too, we are experiencing a turning point. Russia is not even trying to give its invasion of Ukraine the appearance of legitimacy under international law, not to mention international humanitarian law, which Russia is breaking with every targeted bombing of homes, schools, and clinics. For what we are talking about today, global governance and global solution, this means two things. First, the greatest possible unity of the international community. That is our most important asset in defending the principles of international order and restoring peace in Europe. And secondly, we need to reach an understanding very quickly on how we can continue to work on the future issues of humanity globally and multilaterally despite this turning point. It is good that we have the opportunity to discuss both of these aspects today. In terms of unity, we have set standards in recent weeks. Just last Thursday, for the first time ever, there were summit meetings of NATO, the G7, and the EU in Brussels on the same day. The meetings show today a broad global alliance for peace and justice is standing closer together than ever before. This historic day with the NATO, G7, and European Council summits has once again made one thing very clear, which is often overlooked in multilateral day-to-day business. Our alliances are more than mere marriages of convenience. Our unity is not solely owed to our collective horror at Russia's breach of international law. Above all, it is also the result of weeks and months of intensive coordination processes that we have conducted together with our partners. It is therefore no coincidence that the sanctions are hitting Russia so hard and so precisely. One thing is clear, we still have other options up our sleeves, which we will use in a targeted manner if necessary. Unlike in the past, it did not take weeks or months for the first sanctions to be imposed after the attack. It took hours. Russia is now largely isolated in the international economic and financial system, and we are continuing to increase the pressure. Under our G7 presidency, the group of economically strong democracies took further, very concrete decisions at its summit last week. Together, we are once again increasing aid to Ukraine. Together, we're also stepping up support for Ukraine's neighbors. Together, we are committing ourselves to taking in refugees from Ukraine. Together, we are working to reduce energy dependence on Russia. And together, we are developing solutions in the event of energy supply shortages and for global food security. Germany is increasing its humanitarian support for Ukraine and its neighboring states to more than 370 million euros. And we will provide an additional 430 million euros for the global fight against hunger. A large part of this will go to the World Food Programme, which is particularly affected by the current price rises. Particularly in these difficult times, it is clear that the G7 brings together partners that are guided by common values, interests, and commitments. This is what makes us strong. And this brings me to the second question. How can we harness this unity that we are currently experiencing to solve global problems? As a community of values, of strong economic democracies, the G7 also has a very special role to play here. Progress towards an equitable world is the motto that we have chosen for our G7 presidency. For as dramatic and tragic as the war of aggression against Ukraine is, it must not lead us as the G7 our responsibility for global challenges such as the climate crisis or the pandemic. On the contrary, many of the goals we set ourselves at the beginning of the year are becoming even more urgent in view of the changed world situation. It has also already become clear that in view of the millions of refugees in and from Ukraine, humanitarian issues are now also moving into the focus of our presidency. This is reflected in the decisions we took last week. And in addition, the corona pandemic is not over. That is why we want to advance the issue of vaccine equity during our G7 presidency. We must not lose sight of the WHO goal of vaccinating 70% of all people worldwide, as ambitious as that sounds. After all, the pandemic will not be over here either until we have it under control worldwide. To achieve this goal, the global community has launched the ACT Accelerator, an initiative to make vaccines, drugs, and tests available around the globe. Germany will provide $1.5 billion in additional funding for this and other programs this year. We are thus sending a signal of responsibility and solidarity during our G7 presidency. To cope with this pandemic and prepare for further health crises, we are also counting on strengthening the WHO and providing it with adequate funding. We need a strong international health infrastructure, especially in view of future crises. That is why we will also promote the global vaccine production. Just a few weeks ago, we launched an initial project together with colleagues from 4 African countries, the European Union, the African Union, and BioNTech, to boost the production of mRNA vaccines in Africa. And especially now, we are committed to peace and security, to open and resilient societies, and to protecting and strengthening human rights. These are, of course, permanent tasks, but we see that in view of the war, we need to provide more support and protection for human rights defenders, women journalists, researchers, and artists from Ukraine, and we will do that. Defending liberal democracy, social participation, and freedom of the press, defending ourselves against disinformation and cyber attacks, all of this requires our own strength. In the G7, this means, for example, that we will exchange information on disinformation campaigns even more intensively and coordinate our responses. But we also need to think about how we organize cooperation internationally. The United Nations, the G20, the WTO, they remain essential for global exchange, legitimacy, and the search for compromises. But let's not fool ourselves. With Russia on a course of war, and also with other authoritarian states, this will not become easier in the coming years. All the more important, therefore, are new impulses, ambitious goals, and creative ideas, including from the outside. If you want to promote change, you should work together with those who stand for change. Often, these are the actors of civil society. That is why we have made our G7 presidency as open and inclusive as possible. We are committed to intensive dialogue with trade unions and business associations, with scientists, with young people, women, NGOs, and think tanks. I know that this is also an important concern for many of you, and I am pleased, dear Dennis Snower, that the Global Solutions Initiative and the German Development Institute are making a major contribution to this with Think 7. But for me, it's about more than just a voice and participation. We are striving for a paradigm shift in one particular field where too little progress has been made for too long. I'm obviously talking about international climate policy. The task ahead of us is enormous if we want to achieve the 1.5-degree target, and we have to. In concrete terms, this means that by 2030, we must reduce global CO2 emissions by 45% compared to 2010. And by the middle of the century, we must achieve net zero globally, i.e. CO2 neutrality. An international climate policy based on the lowest common denominator will not achieve this. Instead of waiting for those who are the slowest, we will therefore move forward together with those that are the most ambitious. And this is the idea of an open, cooperative climate club that we will be promoting at the G7 summit in Elmau in June. Together with other committed countries, we want to set minimum standards for climate protection. This will create an international market with comparable competitive conditions that rewards countries for climate-friendly economic activities and protects them from competitive disadvantages. That is the concept, but how can it become a reality? 3 things are important. First, states must commit to ambitious standards for climate protection, and of course, not everyone will introduce a carbon price overnight. Nevertheless, many measures can be taken to make progress towards greenhouse gas neutrality, for example, the rapid expansion of renewable energies or the reduction of subsidies for fossil energies. Secondly, it is important to drive the green transformation of industry. We need a common approach to decarbonizing industry to prevent companies from migrating to countries with a lax climate policy. The Climate Club is therefore intended to become a catalyst for jointly advancing clean, young technologies such as green hydrogen. Thirdly, we need international partners far beyond the G7 who are also committed to an ambitious climate policy. This last point, the open and cooperative nature of the Climate Club, is crucial. Because without cooperation between major emitters, emerging economies, and developing countries, we will not make headway. As the current G7 chair, I'm therefore campaigning for our African and Indo-Pacific partners to also participate in the Climate Club. To make this interesting for them, we will of course also talk about climate financing and technology transfers. In this way, we are not replacing existing processes in international climate protection, we are complementing them and we are giving them wings. We saw that such an approach can succeed in the debate on the global minimum tax. There, too, some had to lead the way and then gradually bring the others on board. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also approaching the preparations for the summit in Elmau in this spirit. We've got exactly 3 months to go until then, and my goal is for this summit to send out a strong signal from the G7 for progress, for prosperity, for peace and security, and now I'm looking forward to exchanging ideas with you. Thank you.
Herzlich willkommen. Schauen, ob das Mikrofon an ist.
Very cordial welcome. Let's see if the microphone works. Yes, it does. Cordial welcome, Mr. Chancellor. It is nice to have you here today in indeed a very critical situation. My name is Ali Aslan. I'm an international journalist.
Because as you all know, the Global Solutions Summit has a global audience, and therefore I will pose my questions in English, but Chancellor Scholz will answer in German. That's how we have arranged for this conversation, which will be wide-ranging. And let me dive right in, Chancellor Scholz. You've already laid out many of the challenges that you are facing, that the world is facing. You've been in power, you've been in the office as Chancellor for a little over 100 days now. Usually the first 100 days are somewhat associated with a bit of a political honeymoon. But you had to hit the ground running, didn't you? Were the first 100 days much more turbulent than you had thought or probably feared?
Nein.
No. In fact, it was recognizable that the tensions had increased and we had to further escalation in Ukraine, and that a potential aggression of Russia against Ukraine couldn't be excluded. So the preparation for this issue was something that concerned me from the beginning, and it made it possible for us to discuss two things. First, how are we dealing with this potentiality? So we prepared the sanctions that I just talked about. They had been prepared weeks prior to the war. If that had not been the case, they couldn't have been as effective as they were. And secondly, we also dealt with the issue of what we are doing with regard to our import dependencies. What are we doing then? And as we did this in due time, we took some measures that weren't noticed by everybody to trigger additional imports for our storages, but we also prepared decisions that we now made, i.e. those that now make it possible for us to try to reduce our import and dependencies, coal and gas, etc., or coal and oil, and reduce them towards zero and create new technical possibilities with regard to gas by building LNG terminals in the coasts of the Baltic Sea in North Germany, projects that have existed for quite a while that I also advanced as the Lord Mayor of Hamburg, and we're doing this now at a speed that is quite unusual for Germany.
That we're facing, the Global Solutions Summit is about finding solutions to humanity's major challenges in difficult times, and I think I'm stating the obvious when I say there's absolutely no shortage of those challenges. The pandemic, of course, you named it, it's still ongoing. Now we have a war in the heart of Europe, concerns about rising heating and gas prices, and of course, once again, a large movement of refugees in Europe. Germany, let's talk about the war in the Ukraine, of course. Inevitably, this is the major focus, one of the major focuses that this part of the world, at least, is very much occupied with. Germany has been criticized for rejecting calls to impose an immediate ban on Russian gas and oil exports. You have repeatedly argued that such a move would trigger an economic recession, not just in Germany, but in Europe as well. And you also have said that Germany will end its energy dependence on Russia as quickly as possible, but that the process will take some time. How much time? Do you have a goal in mind? Is there a time frame that is internally being discussed?
Zunächst mal ist es so, dass die Abhängigkeit
Now, first, the dependency of many European countries and also other countries in the world regarding coal, oil, gas, and sometimes other resources from Russia are higher than those from Germany, but Germany is also dependent. That needs to be admitted. Countries in the south of Europe are also very much dependent on these imports. If you look at Italy, this is the consequence of another crisis, namely the time where the supply of Iranian gas wasn't good anymore because of the conflicts that happened. Then some switched to importing Russian gas. So you see that the issue of reducing one's dependency is a very long-lasting issue. So our task is clear. We want to now create the technical conditions to enable us to use different importers. And I repeat what I already said. As we already imported a lot of things by boat, it will be fast for coal and oil, maybe even this year, as early as this year, and the companies are actively preparing these changes now. And when it comes to gas, the infrastructure development is crucial, but we have started with this. We didn't start from zero. These are plans that could have already been put into practice if the prices for pipeline gas hadn't been as low as they were, so that this never was a true business case. But this has now changed, and it's also become a political issue to drive this ahead. That's the question of dependencies. And the second part of the question, Germany is among those countries that are already embarking on the path of moving away from fossil fuels for heating, and we're doing this very quickly. In 2040, Germany wants to be CO2 neutral, and when I tell you that, this is not a lot of time left. This means that towards the end of the 2030s, we will have to have created most of the conditions for this, so the time is short. So this year, there will be far-reaching decisions, the structure of the plans, the goals for the plans regarding the expansion of renewables will have to be created in a way that we can succeed with this in the short run. So our goal is extremely ambitious, and maybe because this is also an example for other successful industrialized nations. Let me give you some figures. For electricity purposes, Germany needs 600 terawatt hours. At the end of this decade, it will be 800 terawatt hours. So this means that just for this decade, the task is to replace production sources based on fossil fuels or nuclear energy, and the additional creation of capacities. We need to do this in order to cover this, and towards the end of the 2030s, it will be somewhere between 1,600 and 1,800 terawatt hours. This is frequently forgotten in these discussions where everybody thinks of mobility and heating one's home. The biggest consumption is in the realm of industrial production, and this is the actual technological modernization. This is happening in Germany now. If steel is being produced without fossil fuels, if cement is being used without fossil fuels, if the chemical industry works without this fuel. This is what the companies want to do. They are as enthusiastic as they were 100 years ago with the large-scale implementation of new technologies. So we will be seeing 2 decades of growth and high investments that we haven't seen in the global industry for a long time. But this needs to start now, and we're doing this.
The process of moving away from Russian energy dependence has already started in Germany. The acknowledgement is there, no doubt. But you know that EU partners and the former US President Donald Trump, of course, has criticized Germany repeatedly for that particular dependence on Russian energy, which we are now trying to reverse here in Germany. Why was this wake-up call needed? Why was the war in Ukraine needed to recognize that the dependence perhaps was a very delicate issue? Why wasn't Germany better prepared? 2014 perhaps could have already been a warning, no?
Es war eine Warnung, deshalb
It was a warning, and that's why in the past years we worked towards independence by expanding renewable energies, and I'd like to say that with the new government, this will to actually do it has dramatically increased, because on the one hand there's the call to do it and the appeal to do it, and the authorization of installations on land and in the sea is always quite some distance, and we are now doing this, and it's also something that you can see we have this will to pursue these goals, and I can observe this from different perspectives. The LNG offers weren't expanded because nobody wanted to sell LNG, including the United States. And the fact that this has changed now is making a difference. And the same applies to other countries in the world. Our Minister of Economic Affairs just visited Qatar. I talked to the Canadian Prime Minister. I mean, this is also a change that we're seeing.
Indeed, that need to be implemented and are the direct result of the war in Ukraine. One of the big changes, of course, is Germany's military spending. You have single-handedly overturned decades of German foreign policy tradition by announcing that your country would raise its military budget by 100 billion euros. Some were surprised, but some are also concerned that this might come at the expense of other much-needed ventures, such as healthcare, of course, the fight against climate change, which you have mentioned repeatedly in your speech, social welfare. Are those concerns justified that this new focus on military spending, which Germany prior did not have, will or could come at the expense of many, many other essential items and topics?
das ist definitiv ausgeschlossen.
That can definitely be excluded. We chose the path of setting up a special fund for the armed forces because the other endeavors of modernizing our industry will not be postponed. We want to tackle them as well because they're urgently necessary. We cannot talk about energy dependence and at the same time not advance the dramatic expansion of renewables. This will require public investments, a lot more investments, mostly also private investments. Our power grid, our transmission grid is privately structured. Most of the plants are privately operated. The big companies that now provide electricity or based on hydrogen, and they're privately owned, globally acting companies. So we now need to set the framework for these investments. Nonetheless, public money will be necessary and we will make it available. And the same applies to what is also very much needed in times like these, namely strengthening the social cohesion, strengthening the rights of our society, because if we want to be cohesive, it will not work based on appeals only. It will only work when everybody in society sees and perceives themselves as an equal part of this society that has embarked on this path. So we made the decision and we can build on a good foundation, which is frequently overlooked in the European Union. Germany is the country that is spending the most money on defense. And now it's going to be a lot more. So in Europe, we will be the country with the biggest military contribution to the NATO defense structure, and particularly in areas where others cannot meet these goals, particularly with regard to the territorial defense of both the country and the alliance. It will be Germany and the US.
And thinking regarding its energy policies, regarding its military policies, defense budget is one thing, but of course the war in Ukraine is causing tremendous human suffering. It's a great deal of humanitarian crisis which we are witnessing once again, and once again, just like 2015, Germany is once again taking center stage when it comes to taking in hundreds of thousands of refugees. This time, of course, from Ukraine, nearly 250,000 refugees up until now from Ukraine have found their way to Germany. Your predecessor, Chancellor Merkel, of course, back then created this by now very famous or infamous slogan, "Wir schaffen das." How would you describe today's situation?
Es ist etwas ganz Besonderes, dass die gesamte Europäische Union
It's a very special situation that the entire European Union decided to take in the refugees from Ukraine without any restrictions, without complications, without additional risks you need to enter into to organize the crossing of borders because of the war in Ukraine. These refugees can now come, and they are. We know that it's over 3 million that have set out towards Europe, and if you know how many million are also being displaced within Ukraine, you can do the math yourself and see how this can still develop. As far as the willingness to take in refugees is concerned, it is remarkable that many countries in the east of Europe are doing this. The Baltic countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. That's another situation now, and those in the second row, Czech Republic and Austria, are stepping up their efforts, as does Germany. You said it yourself. Poland probably took in more than 2 million refugees. Some moved on. In Germany, we now have more than 300,000 already, and I expect this number to rise. This refugee migration is different. The refugees are children, their mothers, older people, so it's difficult to forecast what is going to happen when the war will soon end, whether the men will come and join them or whether they will return. The mothers and children and the older people will have to wait for this. Those who now came need to be given shelter and find some tranquility. And we will be able, as a society, if we stand shoulder to shoulder, we'll be able to deal with this, because we have a situation now that is characterized by our labor markets desperately looking for workers, and this is not a temporary situation. This will last for the next years to come. So if we combine this with integration measures, language and schooling possibilities, this might be a good momentum for a good integration. And if I can conclude by saying this might also change the vantage point that many nations in Europe look at migration. And Germany has to be self-critical here as well. In the past decades, we've repeatedly experienced migration movements, refugee movements from individual countries, and when you asked whether you could get some help here, it was always said, now this is happening in your country, not in ours. But now we've experienced that this can happen anywhere, and maybe this changes the debate and will make more creative solutions possible.
Is a very diverse one, very knowledgeable one. We're happy and lucky to have him here with us. A community that I would like to make use of by incorporating them now into the discussion. For instance, we have Dr. Anja Langenbucher, who's the head of the Europe Bureau of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's here with us. Anja, I want to give you the opportunity to address the Chancellor. He's with us. We'll get you a microphone. Please, perhaps you can get up, and happy to incorporate your question. Please, Anja.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. The COVID crisis and after the Ukraine war now, of course, this is affecting the people in Africa and the Middle East disproportionately. I mean, we have 31 million people sliding back into poverty in 2020. 13 million more are expected already now that are really facing hunger as a direct effect of the Ukrainian war. And of course, all of that means sliding back from the progress we've made towards the SDGs. You spoke about a turning point, a Trendwende in the German foreign and security policy. And I'm wondering, isn't that also the moment to think about development policy? And what can we do here? And thinking the two things together and type of a Trendwende in development policy and poverty reduction as well. Thank you.
Schönen Dank für die Frage und auch für
Thank you very much for the question and also for your engaged work, which is very important because we can only be successful together. I think it is good that the money we've made available for development cooperation has increased in Germany over the past years. It's a level that we've strived for a long time, but has been achieved now. And we had committed to this for many years already. So it's not just about the 2% for defense expenditure, but also the other share that we had committed with regard to humanitarian aid and ODA. It's important to me that we understand that these things go together. I'm very much concerned about the global food situation. Russia and Ukraine are two of the main exporters of two important food staples, namely wheat. And if that disappears, there will be great difficulties in many countries to feed their populations. This could end up in situations of mass starvings, and we cannot just let this happen and just watch. So we have to help. We have to help with the international programs that try to avoid particularly that. And the same applies to the way we combat the pandemic. From the beginning on, we put a lot of money into international programs like COVAX and others to ensure that possibilities to vaccinate the world can be financed. We now have enough vaccinations that are available. There are huge logistical problems to roll them out to the people in the world. And in addition to this, there are also big problems with regard to convincing many people to go and get vaccinated. This does not just happen in some countries in Europe, including Germany. In some areas, this is a global phenomenon. And we should understand, as long as the pandemic cannot be controlled to a certain extent through the vaccination efforts, it will be with us. So it's not just a humanitarian approach, it's our very own interest. What I personally find good and right is that we succeeded in setting up production sites in 4 countries of Africa where vaccines can be produced, and then also further developments can be made to use those for the classical diseases there as well.
Extensively in your answer about the distribution of vaccines equally, fairly amongst all continents, but particularly Africa. We have a young global changer here with us, Abir Ibrahim, who's based in Sudan, is doing wonderful work in Sudan. Yeah, Abir, if you could get up, I want to give you the opportunity also to address the Chancellor here. Make use of your presence here. Your question, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chancellor, so living and working in Africa in various capacities with the UN, where we roll out the biggest partnership with COVAX, and also with the World Economic Forum, and now as a Global Solution Ambassador of Africa. Africa is a population of 1.3 billion, and there are less than 11% of the continent that's actually vaccinated fully. One way to increase vaccination across the continent and globally is to waive the patent rights of COVID vaccine. Now, this has been demanded by many, including the UN Secretary General at this very summit last year. And with COVID cases rising again, will Germany finally get on board with more than 100 other nations to put people before profit and to support a full TRIPS waiver? So countries in the global south, like Sudan and across the continent, can have access to vaccines urgently. We cannot be in the same position that next year facing another deadly variant. So I just wanted to echo what you said earlier about we can only be successful together. Thank you.
Thank you, Abir. Chancellor
Ja,
Scholz.
schönen Dank für die Frage.
Thank you very much for this question. As I already said, from my point of view, thank you for the question. From my point of view, the right path forward is to ensure that there are production capacities available everywhere in the world. This is a highly complicated technology that cannot just be applied. I remember how difficult it was to establish production sites in short time, also with the certification and authorization processes that are necessary. So I think the great founders of BioNTech, together with Pfizer, they are selling their product. They set out to do the right thing by saying the core production site, which is not bigger than a container, is something that will be built in different places in the world, so that surrounding that a production facility for regional supply will be made possible. I believe the rights of those who developed something new, who innovated something, are important to not destroy technical progress, but at the same time we need to ensure that these technologies can and will be used everywhere. So the route that BioNTech embarked upon is the right one, I believe. We supported it. There are 4 countries in Africa for the moment. More will follow, and this, I believe, will help us in this situation. What we do need is the big scientific progress that was translated into practice be beneficial to all of us, so that the inventors of this vaccine originally wanted to find something against cancer or other diseases, but they probably developed a technology now that will enable us at a faster speed to be able to react to new infections and health dangers. And this is basically good news for the people.
Which is still ongoing, as you said, Chancellor Scholz. You repeatedly spoke out in favor of a general vaccine mandate, but that call comes at a time when many countries are largely removing all COVID restrictions. Some are dropping the initial thought of having a general vaccine mandate. We talked a lot today here on stage about Germany rethinking its stances on many issues: energy, security policy, foreign policy, development policy. There's some rethinking going on also on that front. Are you still in favor of a general vaccine mandate, despite perhaps the developments that we're seeing globally, the opening up, the fact that we are here now in person again? Last year, you and I had a conversation on screen. Now we're here. Wonderful to see the audience back. Is there some backtracking perhaps going on?
Vielleicht darf ich Ihre Frage benutzen jetzt.
Maybe I'll use your question to repeat for the benefit of the German audience. As opposed to the debate that we're having here, most of the countries surrounding Germany have loosened their restrictions a lot more. We are still among the stricter countries, but by doing this, we succeeded in dealing with the Omicron challenges quite well throughout January, February, and this month. Nobody would have predicted it like this, but it was this mix of smartly chosen restrictions without going into another lockdown. We chose that path, and it was the right one. It was an important one, and we protected ourselves. What we need to understand is that Germany, for reasons I do regret a lot, we weren't able to achieve a vaccination rate that provides good protection against new waves of infections. I was recently visited by my great Danish colleague who, if I remember correctly, reported that among the 60-year plus 60s, 98 to 99% are vaccinated. These are numbers that we aren't reaching at all, and 96% of the entire population already has 3 vaccinations, including the booster vaccination. So if vaccinations happen, which is something we cannot prevent, I mean, a vaccination is not like a spacesuit. It just protects us a little bit better, and these numbers are a lot better than the ones that we have, even though in international comparisons they're not that bad, but they're not high enough to really protect the entire population. And the German parliament will soon decide on whether there will be a mandate for vaccinations, and we're not talking about today, we're talking about the next fall, in view of the fact that we need to prepare ourselves to potential new waves of infections, and we can only deal with this when we have a high vaccination rate.
Vaccine mandates, and Germany suit, unlike other countries, and opening up. It's still going to take a much more conservative stance here. That's what I'm hearing.
Ja, aber die generelle Regelung ist jetzt.
Yes, but the general rule is that it's just public transport, public institutions, and hospitals wherever infections are a little bit more severe.
And we are here, of course, at the Global Solutions Summit. That global challenges require a multilateral response. Multilateralism is, of course, the main theme here and something that you deeply believe in. The next G20 summit, of course, the G20 is one of the major umbrellas of multilateralism. The next G20 summit, of course, will take place in Indonesia. And we have with us here in the audience Professor Bambang Brojonegoro, who is actually heading the T20 project under the G20 Indonesian presidency. Professor, I want to give you a chance. Thanks for coming to Berlin, first and foremost. Thanks for being here. I want to give you a chance to address the Chancellor as well.
Mr. Chancellor, for all, thank you very much for your inspiring speech. I think I will switch to the energy issue. So I would like to know the initiative from Germany and also G7 in supporting difficult and costly energy transition, especially for lower income countries. Thank you.
Schönen Dank und
Thank you very much. I want to wish all the best to your country for the G20 presidency. That's anything but easy. This is going to be a tremendous task, and I talked on the phone to your president and asked him how this can all work. We'll probably do this more often, and I hope that Indonesia and Germany as presidents of the G20 and the G7 will cooperate. It started well, and it will continue like that. Sure, when we talk about climate change and the necessary transformation to switch our energy production to renewable sources, this will not work unless it works for the world as a whole. This is a debate that every country is seeing. In the countries of the global south, the question comes up, how can this be funded in view of these big challenges? Everything is difficult already, and why should we renounce development perspectives? And this is right. In the countries of the global north, including Germany, the discussion is the other way around. As a democratic politician, you have to rightly deal with questions like, we are responsible for 2% of the global emissions only. Why should everything happen here? If it were done elsewhere, it would be a lot more effective. But the mere fact that these two questions exist show that it's an urgent problem, and you cannot expect the respective other side to answer. There can only be a common answer. For the citizens in Germany and Europe, I tell them it's our task. We can develop the technologies and ensure that they are as affordable and as efficient as those that were developed to use coal, gas, and oil, and they can then contribute to growing affluence, both here and in other countries. We have the economic, financial, and engineering power, the knowledge to do this. And this is what we are also offering to the other countries in the world, to use these technologies everywhere, and then it's easier to not decide to build a new coal-powered plant if there is a technological alternative and we prove that it works. But it will not be possible without financial support in alternative solutions. This is something that was also decided during COP26, and it's correct. Germany will always be responsible with others to look at the development perspectives of countries that want to achieve the same level of affluence that we have in our countries. And we are working towards this, and we're making this possible because it needs to be in our interest to jointly achieve a good level of wealth, to have a good middle class, a strong middle class everywhere in the world, that the affluence that exists here is possible elsewhere without damaging the climate, because that would be detrimental for everybody. And this is a task that we could only solve together.
Very, very intensive, interesting conversation here. But I do see in the audience, I do see Bob Morris, the global CEO of PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. I want to give him a chance to address the Chancellor as well. Bob, go ahead.
Chancellor, thank you very much for being here today and sharing your valuable time with everything that's going on in the world. You talked about in your opening speech the war in the Ukraine. You also talked about the other problems the world needs to solve. So I want to focus specifically on the concept of climate change and the follow-up to the question that was just asked. You talked about what governments need to focus on, particularly with the G7 and G20 meeting coming up. Some of those words are very similar to what we've heard in the past. And one will argue we're falling behind on the war on climate. So what has to happen and be different from government as we think about the war on climate? And what can business and the citizens of the world do differently to make sure that we don't fall further behind?
Thank you, Bob.
Schönen Dank für die Frage. Was wir
Thank
brauchen,
you for the question. Thank you for the question. What we need is confidence into the technologies for the future, and we do not believe this to be something self-evident. We have to put a little bit of effort into it. It's not about just changing our lifestyles, not traveling anymore, reducing our level of affluence. It's not about, renouncing things. If possible, it's about increasing affluence to ensure that the affluence that we have here, the progress that we have here, translate that elsewhere so that everybody can catch up. That needs to be the goal for this century. And if this is the case, the answer is we have modern technologies to make this possible with. So let me repeat. For me, this means the use of renewable energies in general in industry. As far as wind power, solar power is concerned, we need to strengthen our power grid to deal with all the challenges connected to this, to do this in a scaled-up way, that the use of hydrogen, which is being successfully used on the small scale, can also be used in the big scale. And this is where business, industry, and the state have to come together. These are decisions that were made about 100 years ago in Germany. I looked at the so-called industrial park in Leuna, where in the early 1920s, over just 2 years on a green field, 10,000 jobs were created with labor technologies of the chemical industry that prior to that had only been tried and tested in labs and never existed on a big manufacturing scale. This is the path that we are on at the moment. And this also means that consulting companies, investment firms, and shareholders of large companies have to say, we now want you to immediately take the decision to produce steel using electric power, or that you immediately change your production processes in the chemical industry, that you no longer use fossil fuels for the different processes and switch to hydrogen, for example, and electricity. This would be something that needs to become as self-evident as the use of coal, oil, and gas today. Hydrogen will have to, replace this. There will have to be new production sites, new technologies, and everything needs to be done in this direction. But the nice thing is, these technologies already exist. It doesn't have to be invented from zero. It's not a fata morgana, a mirage that moves further into the distance the closer you get. No, these are things that can be put into reality. But what we need are courageous men and women in politics, in companies, and in civil society, those who say we want to embark on this path. And I have the feeling the moment has come. I do see that employees, those that I'm talking to, also tell me, do it now. They don't say, let's not do it, let's just keep staying at business as usual for the next 10 years. No, they say, do it now. We want to participate in the future. And this is also how we can keep our societies together in the individual countries and at the global level.
Out of time. Let me just ask you this. You've had a very long and distinguished political career. You've been the mayor of Hamburg. You've been the vice chancellor. You've been the finance minister. Now for a little over 3 months, almost 4 months now, you are the chancellor. It's pretty much the highest office that this country holds. what is the single biggest difference, perhaps single biggest challenge, single biggest difficulty that you are noticing, that you are feeling compared to your previous roles that you've held up until now?
Es ist nicht überraschend, aber
It's not surprising, but still right to say that the person who governs Germany has a role to play when it comes to the development of the European Union and also the development of the world, and you shouldn't shy away from this. We are too economically powerful and too big as a country to just comment what is happening on what is happening. We need to participate, and that's my task as the head of government of this country.
That you are spending an hour with us here at such a critical juncture in European history, in your schedule, of course, and I think I speak for all when I say we're most grateful that you took the time to address this audience, to speak about a wide-ranging issue. Thank you so much, Chancellor Scholz, for being here today. Thank you so much.